Using this knife in the kitchen was a rather entertaining affair, and that's essentially the way you had to look at it. I don't know if it's the absolute worst knife that I've ever used, but it's pretty high up on the list. To start off with, it came with one of the more unusual grinds I've ever seen, and I can't possibly believe it was intentional. This side had a hollow primary grind and a traditional V-ground edge bevel. This side just had one flat bevel. So it was chisel type ground. The secondary edge bevel actually came back further than the primary grind. So there was a large section back here that just had an edge bevel on the flat stock. Nothing came back all the way to the handle. The edge was also just left with the rough, very shaping grit. No attempt made to deburr it, and it was actually burnt blue-black through the tip. So I didn't have much sort of positive outlook for the edge retention. It wasn't extremely sharp to begin with, and just had that sort of rough, sort of sawing effect, which it maintained for slightly more than a month. Which isn't tremendously bad. It's not the lowest performance I've seen. But what was happening was that the steel was fracturing, and that fracturing was giving it a very coarse saw type effect, which it maintained until it fractured so much that there was essentially, it had thickened to the point where it was stable enough and then just wore smooth. The first check I did on edge retention was extremely low. The edge simply would not form cleanly at all, and the sharpness at the start was similar to the sharpness at the end of the test for most of the other knives. But as with many knives, and again this was burnt blue-black, I suspected the very rough initial grinding was causing most of the problems, and sharpening, recheck, sharpening, recheck. And after about 4 times it ended up where you would expect it for a 420 class type steel. But back to why I said if this is not one of the worst knives I've ever seen, it's relatively close. It has an extremely short partial tang, only about right here. And it has a hole cut out for a pin, but it's not actually pinned. And the blade and handle actually separated during the cardboard cutting, just popped right apart. Back to actually trying to use it in the kitchen, again, it's really low. The performance actually is that bad on most things that even non-kitchen knives are better than it. The big problem was that the secondary edge on this side, again, was at such a high angle and the finish was so rough that trying to use it for even simple tasks like peeling potatoes, again, your standard tactical type folders, let alone something like an Opinel or Duke or Swiss Army knife, much better than it. But even your standard, more tactical type folders could easily peel potatoes much better than this, because of the heavy secondary edge bevel and very rough initial finish. Now that sawing type edge was enough to, allow it to cut tomatoes and green onions. But looking at it from a relative perspective, one of the worst performances I've ever seen. And in fact, most of the problems that I've seen on some of the other knives, almost all of them are seen on this one. Even looking at the handle, it was basically just injected molding. But there was no attempt made to finish it at all. So the very rough lines from the injection molding were still there, very abrasive, sharp at the end, sharp at the front, sharp right here at the transitions to the blade. The blade was left extremely square on the spine, so really not comfortable in any respect to try to hold on to it. And the blade stock is so thin, and the blade itself heat treated so far less than optimal, that the blade will actually twist and warp. Even like you try to cut a potato, the blade will bend. And this blade is actually warped back and forth like this, because even trying to cut through like a watermelon and squash, it doesn't have the rigidity, and the blade will actually take a permanent set, even like cutting stiff fruits and vegetables. And I even bent it trying to cut a relatively crusty, okay, it was a thick crust, but it was still just a loaf of bread. And again, the blade actually warped trying to cut through the heavy crust of bread. And you can see now it's even bent. And every week, essentially, I was straightening it, trying to get it back to true. Now, again, this is called a roast sort of carving knife, and I was using it well outside of that area, but I've never seen a knife that restrictive before. Just using it on meats alone, it does okay. Meats are relatively soft. They don't put any binding force on the blade. It does have a nice bit of length, and that saw type edge that it came with could cut up meats as long as you're using an exaggerated slicing motion. You won't do any kind of press cuts with it at all. But again, the blade was so weak because of the extremely thin stock, and like I said, it's also relatively soft. You can easily file it. You had no ability whatsoever to work in around joints to try to do any kind of separation, because again, the blade will actually bend. I mean, you can trivially bend that. That's just now put a permanent bend in the tip, straighten it back out and kink it the other way. Working on fish, just small fish, like trout about 12 inches, salmon, say a couple of pounds, that type of deal. The edge would impact even from the slight bones and the backbone or ribs. Not talking about heavy staking or scalloping or splitting on, 10 to 15 pound cod. Just small fish, again, impactions all along the edge. I've done a bunch of modifications to this. I've tapered the handle in here to the blade. I've rounded off the end. I've rounded off this here. I've rounded off the spine. I've flattened both sides of the bevel so they're symmetric, and zeroed them right down to the edge. Cleaned up the tip a little bit, made it a bit sharper. And it's kind of an interesting knife now that I'm just going to throw in the kitchen, and it's just going to be used just alongside all the other knives. And I'm rather curious to see how it holds up under extended use. And I've also put a little sharpening notch here to allow me to sharpen it all the way down. In retrospect, I mean, I didn't really expect a lot from this because it was the least cost of all the inexpensive knives that I've seen. But I've never seen a knife that had less attention paid to it when it was made than this one. And like I said, I've never seen a knife combine almost every problem you could imagine with a knife all together in the one blade. And like I said, if this is not the worst knife I've ever seen, it's up there with them. And it would be very difficult to try to make a knife that's worse than this unless you intentionally sat down to do it. It's kind of funny.